Professor of Sociology and Politics at New York University and faculty affiliate at NYU's Center for Data Science and the Center for European and Mediterranean Studies. Relying on survey methods, computational text analysis, and experimental research, his work applies insights from cultural sociology to the study of politics in the United States and Europe, with a particular focus on nationalism, populism, and the rise of radical right parties. He serves as a deputy editor at Sociological Science and an editorial team member at Nations and Nationalism. Our second panelist this evening is Professor Daniel Laurison. Professor Laurison is an associate professor of sociology at Swarthmore College, a former editor-in-chief of the British Journal of Sociology, and a 2021-2023 Carnegie Fellow. He leads the Politics and Equal Participation Lab at Swarthmore and directs the new Healthy, Equitable, and Responsive Research Initiative. Professor Laurison's research focuses on class inequality, social mobility, political participation, and the intersections of race and class politics. Professor Laurison has authored 2 books, the first one being The Class Ceiling, Why It Pays to Be Privileged, which was published in 2019, and more recently, Producing Politics Inside the Exclusive Campaign World, where the privileged few shape politics for all of us. Our third panelist this evening is Professor Julian Wamble. Professor Wamble is an assistant professor of political science at George Washington University, where he specializes in American political behavior and race and ethnic politics. His forthcoming book, We Choose You: How Black Voters Decide Which Candidates to Support, will be published in January 2025 with Cambridge University Press. The book explores how Black voters select candidates who signal a commitment to the community's political interests. His work has been published in journals such as the Journal of Politics and PS, Political Science and Politics. Professor Wamble received the 2022 Distinguished Junior Scholar Award in Political Sociology and Political Psychology, and the 2019 APSA Best Dissertation Award in Race and Ethnic Politics. And last, but certainly not least, we have Professor Amber Wachowski. Professor Wachowski is an associate professor of Public Affairs and holds the Leadership Wisconsin Endowed Chair for the Division of Extension at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Her research explores how diverse communities engage with complex public issues and how social and institutional contexts shape civic engagement. She is the co-author of The Economic Other: Inequality in the American Political Imagination. The book was awarded the Juliet and Alexander L. George Outstanding Political Psychology Book Award in 2021. She serves on the editorial board of the American Political Science Review and advisory boards for the American Political Science Association's Institute for Civically Engaged Research and Civic Pulse. Thank you to all 4 of you for joining us this evening. So just to give you an overview of how we will run the order of events this evening, each panelist will briefly introduce their research, especially as it relates to opinion, participation, and turnout in the upcoming 2024 elections. After each panelist has introduced their research and their perspective, I'll kick the discussion off with a couple of questions that I prepared for our panelists. After the prepared questions, I will open up the floor for audience questions. You can submit questions to the Q&A or raise your hand if you are comfortable either be on camera or speaking to the group. So that's the run of show for this evening. Thank you all for joining us. I'm going to turn the floor over to Professor Bonakowski first for his research overview.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having me. This is a terrific group, and I look forward to our discussion, and thanks to all the attendees for making it this evening. So broadly speaking, my research tries to answer the question of why and how radical right parties and candidates have become mainstream across a wide range of contemporary democracies. So the US is one of the cases I studied, but I try to put it in the context of Eastern, Western European democracies and beyond, because despite the fact that these countries have very different starting conditions and different political systems, different sets of structural shifts over time, their outcomes are relatively similar in the sense that this kind of brand of radical right politics that we've seen pop up over the last 20 years has become part of the political landscape. To different degrees, it's again sort of how the institutions filter these entrance into the political scene varies, but nonetheless, the idea that Trump-like politics or Brexit-like politics or politics like Kaczynski or Orban, etc., or Le Pen are part of today's reality is unmistakable across this wide range of countries. And in my own research, I've tried to point to the importance of nationalism in particular in shaping these outcomes. So thinking about how different segments of domestic populations understand the nation, understand the nation's history, understand the nation's current ideal composition and therefore also future, and how these political cleavages around these national conceptions of the nation become all of a sudden manifest. So part of the argument is that actually, if you look at public opinion research, broad disagreements about the nation of America, the meaning of America, the meaning of France, the meaning of any given nation, have been around for a very long time. There's some sort of almost, you can think of them as always already there. But for most part, they are latent. And it is only in certain historical moments that they become politically manifest and politically mobilizable. And the argument is that this is actually what's happening in contemporary democracies for a set of reasons I'll mention in a minute. So these kind of nationalist cleavages are one ingredient in the rise of radical right politics. The other ingredient that we've heard a lot about is populism, this kind of moral binary that pits morally irredeemable elites against the people as the only true virtuous holders of power. So populism is another ingredient in the rise of this type of politics. And then the third ingredient is authoritarianism. This notion that one can run roughshod over liberal democratic institutions in order to restore the nation to some sort of a kind of a mythical, nostalgic status quo ante. And so the point of my work is that these three ingredients, these nationalist cleavages, kind of anti-elite, deeply moralized populism, and acceptance of authoritarian rule, essentially, are really important in creating the opportunity space for the rise of radical right politics. And they exist both on the supply and demand sides of politics. So they exist both in public attitudes as well as in elite claims, in political messaging of radical right candidates or radical right parties. And the point of a lot of my work is to try to understand why these pre-existing frames that have been around for a while and pre-existing attitudes that also have been present in the population are resonating in new ways in the current historical moment. And there, what I try to argue is that really what's responsible for this renewed resonance is a series of structural changes, rapid structural changes that have been exploited by opportunistic political elites. And if we look at across a wide range of contemporary democracies, these kind of structural shocks, they vary quite a bit. So some of them are economic, no doubt, whether it's trade shocks or deindustrialization, economic crises, but they are not solely economic. They're also about demographic change, about immigration, obviously, about refugee flows. They're about cultural change, about which groups are valued in a given society. They're about social movements. They're about a whole range of different shocks and transformations that vary across the countries that I study quite a bit. But despite this variation, they tend to be exploited in similar ways by radical right elites. So the recipe is basically to appeal to ethno-religious and racial majorities in these countries, and to say, look, you're anxious about all these sources of change. You're seeing, your country transform in certain ways. Well, you should be anxious. You should be afraid because your status as the kind of the dominant majority is at risk. And not only should you be afraid, but you should attribute blame for these changes and for the status threat that you're experiencing. You should attribute that blame to political elites, but also to minorities, ethno-religious and racial minorities and immigrants. And the solution then is to elect me, right? To elect the radical right candidate to restore the nation to its sort of past glory, where your place in the status hierarchy was unquestionable. And when that happens, when political elites manipulate these anxieties and fears in this particular way, what I've argued what they do is they essentially activate these latent nationalist cleavages, which then become politically manifest and become kind of the source of political behavior, the source of voting preferences. And what the result of that is that these radical right parties and candidates become mainstream, become part of the political reality. And if you think about it, once they are kind of normalized, then the entire political contestation becomes around what the nation is and what the nation ought to be, who's in, who's out, who's a legitimate member of the nation, what should the nation look like, and those who favor radical right parties then become willing to accept all kinds of extreme measures to bring the nation back to the way that they, to the kind of past vision that they hold for it. So those extreme measures may mean turning the judicial system against minorities, but it also can mean, and often does mean, subjugating the autonomy of the media, of courts, and ultimately calling into question the very electoral institutions that are at the heart of democratic turning over of power, right, in democratic elections. And so the system of mobilizing nationalist cleavages and of tolerating authoritarian governance practices, once effective in one country, starts diffusing across countries quite rapidly. And so, as we've seen, the number of cases of country cases where radical right parties are present has grown over time. In fact, there are very few negative cases at this point. And that's because politicians across these different places are looking to one another for solutions, looking to one another for mobilization strategies, and for governance strategies as well. And so the entire kind of formula starts diffusing very rapidly across countries. So the way Trump talks, the threats Trump makes, and the kind of promises of what will happen if elected that Trump makes are very similar to what you hear from Viktor Orban, from Kaczynski, from Le Pen, from others. And so we've got this kind of isomorphism that develops over time across these places, across these countries. So I'll stop there because I want to hear from others. But I think of the US as a really important case for obvious reasons. Although a latecomer to the radical right scene in some ways, given the importance of the country geopolitically and the kind of the amount of airspace that Trumpism takes up internationally, the consequences of another Trump presidency here are dire, both domestically and for the future of radical right politics, I think, across the globe, not to mention geopolitics more broadly. So I look forward to our discussion about the upcoming election in more detail in a few minutes.
Great, thank you so much. So next up we have Professor Laursen, and I will turn it over to you.
Great, thank you. All right. So this is a slide. A couple of my students are here, and some of them have seen it 72 times. But I think it's really important to orient us as we're thinking about elections. 2020 had the highest turnout in about 100 years. In the US, the highest portion of eligible voters turned out, and still basically a third of people didn't vote. And what's much more, 2022 was also high for a congressional race, but this is much more common. So the purple in both cases is the portion of people who didn't vote but were eligible. And people who don't vote are disproportionately poor and working class, low income, and they're disproportionately people of color. So there's steep inequality in who turns out and who doesn't, and that's sort of the frame for a very substantial portion of the research that I do. And I think, I could show any number of other images, but I think the key thing to understand is just that the people who don't vote don't look like the people who do in lots and lots of ways. Oops, I didn't mean to have that twice. There we go. Just one other way of looking at this, because survey-based data gives us something like what's on the right, but on the left, I'm showing data based on precincts. And you can see a very similar pattern. And you can also see, so people in the lowest income precincts voted at the lowest rates in both 2016 and 2020. But the level of inequality became larger in 2020 than it was in 2016. So the steepness of that slope went up, or the gap between the rich and the poor in terms of turnout went up. And I think that's also really important to note. And one thing I'm concerned about is whether we see something similar in 2024. But I want to talk briefly about the, so I do a bunch of projects that sort of get at this, but I want to talk briefly about one project which is wrapping up, which is I've worked with undergrad students, community-based researchers, and some grad students as well to do interviews with poor and working class people across the state of Pennsylvania about how they see politics. When we think about who turns out and who doesn't, we often focus on the question of barriers, long lines, the hurdle of registering, et cetera, et cetera. It turns out most of the time when you make voting easier, you don't reduce the inequalities in turnout, at least not immediately. And I think that's in part because there's something else going on for poor and working class people that keeps them from voting, that's ahead of sort of causally before the barriers that they may face. At least that's what we saw in lots of these interviews. So one person we spoke with was named Dan. He was a white man living in Chester, which is the poorest city in Pennsylvania. He worked on as grounds crew for a golf course. We interviewed him at Chester's Waterfront Park, which is advertised as a kind of nice looking park with this picture. It really is mostly just a sidewalk under a bridge on the Delaware River. And just to give you a sense of Chester where he lives, this is one of the sets of storefronts in Chester fairly recently. So it's a really impoverished town. And Dan got that, Dan talked about the concerns he had for the community that he lived in. He said, it seems like there's a lot of violence. He got up at 6 in the morning or 4:30 in the morning to go to his job on this golf course that was an hour bus ride away. And he talked about how when he walked to the bus stop, he saw shell casings from shootings. He had neighbors who had been killed recently, a couple of 14-year-old kids that were killed like a block over. And he said, and it's true, it just feels neglected down here. So he had a real sense of what was going on in his community, and a real sense that there didn't seem to be real efforts from people with power to do very much about it. But he didn't directly connect this to politics when we talked. So in fact, when we asked him about talking about politics, what he said is, I feel like an idiot when I'm talking about politics. I feel like I don't know what I'm talking about, We'd asked him, if you had to sort of say, here's the average person and the amount of attention they pay to politics, where would you put yourself? He said, way, way down low, way down low, not really engaged with politics. And he said, he feels like it's easier to take a step away from politics, to not engage with something where you feel like nobody has the right information yet. In 2020, he did vote, and he had voted against Trump. And he had voted against Trump because he'd heard that Trump was a white supremacist, and he wanted to vote against that guy. And so he voted for Biden. But he was really, when we talked to him in the summer of 2022, he wasn't sure if he'd made the right choice. He had a friend, they invested a little bit of their spare cash in a stock market app that was going down when we talked, and he thought that was probably because of Biden. And his friend had told him basically, that stuff about Trump being a white supremacist is exaggerated. You don't really have to worry about that. So he thought maybe he had made the wrong choice, and he was pretty worried about it. He also felt like he just didn't understand when people talked about what Trump had done on January 6th. His take was basically either he belongs in jail or he doesn't. How is this a debate? I don't understand what people are, what's going on in the news when people are arguing about this. So he felt like politics was something that just, was essentially other people not connected to him, fighting about things that didn't really make sense. And he felt like he didn't have the right sort of language or knowledge to participate, even while he really understood what was going on in his community. He also had really strong opinions about Roe versus Wade. He thought abortion should be a right. He thought there should be more mental health care in his community. But he didn't feel like politics was something that he knew how to talk about the right way. He also said it feels completely out of his control. He said he had a checkered past. Specifically, he'd had a drug addiction and had been sober for about 4 years when we spoke. And he said, I just don't feel like I'm the type of person that people really listen to. I don't think I can have much of a say. I don't think there's anything I could do to change what's going on. We asked him who does get listened to, and he said, people on campuses, people yelling, people writing letters, people different from him, right? People who had finished college or were on college campuses. He also said people who are more well off are who pay attention to politics, who get listened to, people whose safety isn't the first thing they think of when they leave their house in the morning. And the last thing Dan said, and I'm sharing all this because it really speaks to what we heard from a lot of people, is that politics is basically just fighting. So he talked about some of his family members who had really different political views and how they basically, he says they're both good people. They have opposing viewpoints and they think the other person is like sick for what they believe. And he just didn't understand how people who were both good people could be so at odds with each other. And he said, I think they're both a little bit right. They're both right in ways. So overall, for the people we talked to, we heard a lot about, people's real concerns with problems in their communities. We also heard from a lot of people that politics just seems like fighting or arguing or a sham or a joke. It's just something that's by and for other people. It's not by, for, and about people like us, poor and working class people, regular people. Some people said specifically Black or brown people. And a real sense that they don't know the right language to participate. And that last wasn't about not knowing who was running or not knowing about the issues. It was a sense that you had to be a particular kind of person with a particular language in order to participate. So I'll also stop there so we can have a more full conversation, but that's sort of an overview of some of what we've heard from our interviews.
Thank you so much. Next up, we have Professor Julian Wamble. And I'm going to spotlight you. There you are.
Yep. Hi, everyone. So the work that I do focuses on the way that we think about how Black people arrive at the choice of who to vote for. And what I tackle is this kind of misconception and conventional wisdom surrounding the role that race plays in this decision-making process. And so generally speaking, after the Obama era, where we saw this kind of massive uptick in Black turnout, there began this kind of conventional wisdom surrounding this idea that Black people would show up for you if you were Black. And so what we see in the post-Obama era is a number of Black politicians entering into the political fray at higher offices, gubernatorial, senatorial, presidential, seeking support and kind of operating with the assumption that Black voters would support them just by virtue of them being present. And so, and what we see is that it doesn't work. And part of the reason why I argue in my book that it doesn't is because, just put simply, they're not Obama. And that we can't we have to think more specifically about the historical context of his presidency and what that means and meant to Black voters. And that many of these individuals who came after him can't replicate what he did. And so in my book, I call him a unicorn because I think that there are lots of things that he was able to accomplish. And, within political science and across other disciplines, we talk about kind of the perfect storm that led to the moment of Obama becoming president. And so what I argue is that, in fact, there's something else happening underneath the hood of Black voter candidate selection, and that the inability of certain Black politicians to be able to replicate what he accomplished. And then on the other side, we have politicians like President Joe Biden and Representative Steve Cohen, who is a representative in Tennessee, who is a white man who has represented a majority Black district since 2007. And he has continuously been able to get support from Black voters in his district since then, despite running against viable, well-known Black politicians. And so, in theory, President Joe Biden shouldn't have gotten the kind of Black support he got. Steve Cohen shouldn't be able to get all the support he's gotten. And then all of these other Black politicians who have run across the country also shouldn't have been able to, or should have been more successful. And so the question is what's happening? And so I argue that when we're talking about a population like the Black electorate, we're talking about a population that has for a very long time been kind of felt like a bit of a tool used in political spaces and places and not necessarily reaping any tangible benefits. And so that when Black voters kind of come together as a collective, what they're looking for is a sure thing. And so I argue that because most of the contemporary Black politicians that most Black people voted for post-Reconstruction come out of the civil rights movement, that the sacrifices and an understanding of effective political leadership come out of this understanding of civil rights leaders, um, politicians. And so as a result, Black voters are looking for politicians who are willing to sacrifice, whether it be their own financial circumstance, a la Cory Booker, living in the projects of Newark, or they're more taking on bodily harm, whether it be in protest, like we see from the Reverend Senator Raphael Warnock or Representative Cori Bush, politicians who are willing to kind of replicate what their predecessors did. And I argue that this is because Black voters want a sure thing. They want to know that you are really committed to doing this because they've spent a considerable amount of time in their political spaces, getting a lot of lip service. And so I draw on signaling theory, which comes out of any number of different disciplines, to show through survey experiments that a politician who is able to show commitment, particularly one that is seen as more costly, is much more likely to get support from Black voters than those who cannot show that commitment or show maybe lesser commitment through social attachments to institutions or individuals. And that this holds not only for Black politicians, but also for white ones. And so this helps understand how it is that certain politicians who may not be Black are able to garner support from Black voters. And I think that this is important because it really does complicate the narrative about the role that race plays. I think that oftentimes in work that I'm doing now, invites us to think about, the Black electorate as this very kind of multifaceted electorate. And for the longest time, we saw people kind of approach Black voters in this space of you're Black voters, regardless of any other kind of identity markers that you may have that may be politically salient. And it's in this particular election that we're in now, and in somewhat in 2020, where we're seeing a much more gendered conversation arising, right? And we are seeing policies coming out of the Harris camp and that of Trump, where we're seeing very kind of gender specific policy platforms being put forth for the Black electorate. And I think that there are lots of reasons why this may be the case. One of the things that I find in my book that I think is interesting is the reality that, Black women politicians are held to a much higher standard than their Black male counterparts. So what I find is that when you manipulate the kind of commitment that is signaled, what is true is that in the control where there is no commitment signaling at all, Black women are seen to be much more committed than Black men, white women, white men, but that the effect of the signals do nothing for them. And so without proving anything, without having to do anything, Black women are seen to be committed, which in theory feels like a good thing. But in practice, to me, and what I find in other work is that it is much easier to fall off of a high pedestal than it is to climb up to one. And so that the expectations that Black voters have for Black women politicians is just significantly higher. And there's nowhere else to go except down. And so that when we think about kind of what we're witnessing as it pertains to Vice President Harris, I think that there are a lot of people who are very excited. I also think that there are a lot of people who probably have more unrealistic expectations of her than they would say for an Obama. And so that, but the biggest takeaway from the work that I have done and am doing is that Black people approach their electoral choices with a level of pragmatism, even within the realm of using race as an identity, that there is a lot of nuance there. And we've gotten into some of these conversations as it pertains to kind of who gets to take on the moniker of Blackness, right? So we that's a conversation that's been had for both former President Obama and Vice President Harris. And so that within the realm of these particular kinds of understandings, what we see is that Black people are using a level of racial discernment that kind of goes beyond the scope of you look like me, so I'm going to support you, and falls into a much more nuanced space of what it actually means to be a member of this community. And so I think in the broader conversation that we are going to have, that, thinking about that kind of nuance when we think about, the role of race and gender and the way that we see particularly Black voters, but I think, all voters of color and marginalized voters broadly construed, approaching with their particular with the choices that they're ultimately making. And I will stop there.
Thank you so much. I'm going to pass the mic to Professor Wojciechowski.
Thanks so much. So I'm a political scientist by training. I study political behavior, American politics, including public opinion, voter turnout, campaigns and elections. And kind of offering a little bit about the scope of my research, I'll just kind of almost go in like this chronological ordering, I suppose, of my studies that I've conducted over the last decade plus. Much of my early research focused on the relationship between economic hardship and voter turnout. So in that research, I was looking at the relationship between unemployment and voting participation. I also did some research with Paru Shah looking at the impact of the foreclosure crisis, kind of in the immediate years of the Great Recession and its impact on voting participation and the ways in which that fed into widening political inequality. At that time, also publishing a lot on campaign finance, in particular looking at kind of the rise of anonymity in donors and whether or not laws to require or mandate donor disclosure would have any impact on voter candidate evaluations or assessments of campaign appeals. And then with Megan Condon, I wrote a book called The Economic Other, Inequality in the American Political Imagination. And that book looks at how status perceptions affect attitudes about inequality, redistribution, and feelings of political power, and how subjective status perceptions are shaped both by context, kind of who compares with whom, but also psychology, what motivates us to engage in social comparison in the first place, and why might we actually avoid certain types of social comparisons. Megan and I were curious about Americans' somewhat puzzling response to growing inequality. And we're also curious about the role of status, subjective status perceptions, and kind of the process of social comparison, decided to kind of begin an investigation of that. So in that book, we show that when Americans engage in upward social comparison, when they're looking at those at the top of the socioeconomic hierarchy, they are much more supportive of inequality reducing policies. These are sorts of findings that are very consistent with all the expectations from the literature, but we'd see the real disconnect with actually how this would work in practice. Americans would express a much more muted response to growing inequality. So the second half of the book really looks at what are the factors that interrupt that process in which inequality is growing, more people are falling away from the top. We would expect that people would feel that falling status and demand more redistribution. So in the second half of the book, we look at other factors that were also rising with growing inequality. This includes residential income segregation and the ways in which that feeds into our politics, as well as growing financial precarity or insecurity. That combined, we have segregation that limits opportunities to engage in some kinds of comparisons, and we have financial insecurity that leads many to prefer other types of comparisons as a way to protect our sense of self, our ego, if you will. I need to place this book in sort of political time. The book was written, inequality is increasing. It's kind of the Obama era, the transition into the Trump era, or the Trump 2016 time period, 2015, 2016. And so the book concludes with a reflection on political rhetoric and the ways in which candidates and politicians can use social comparisons as a political tool, drawing voters' attentions to particular social comparisons and in the process shaping voters' perceptions of their own subjective status. I think these are some of the dynamics that Bart, I think, was touching on in when he was offering some of his research on populism. More recently, Megan and I have kind of taken a thread out of that book-length project. And we recently published a study that looks at the really remarkable rise in the gender gap in economic evaluations that just widened to historic levels in the Trump administration during the Trump era. And in that paper, we return to status perceptions and the ways in which changes in subjective status help us make sense of gaps in how Americans evaluate the economy and their place within it. And that paper draws particular attention, not just to gender, not just to class, not just to race, but really the ways in which race, gender, class differences in subjective status, what kind of explains those perceptions and how do those perceptions then feed back into how voters evaluate things like the politics, but also in particular the economy. So I'm going to stop there because I'm excited to talk about, I suppose I'm excited to talk about this particular election. And so I'll turn the mic back over to Jennifer to get us going.
Thank you so much for those presentations. That was fascinating. So my first question, as some of you have already touched on elements of this question in your research overviews, but thinking about 2024 has already been an historic election, right? We've had I could list two presidential assassination attempts, or former president, that is. And we've had a late breaking candidate change in the Democratic Party. So lots of dynamics that are specific to 2024. But what I wanted to ask you about was, through the lens of your research, this election cycle, what are the things that you are paying attention to? And that could be on the supply side or on the demand side, as Bart put it, right? So among voters or among candidates, what are the patterns, shifts this cycle that you're seeing that have kind of drawn your attention, and why do you think they might matter? How are they different than, let's say, 2016 or 2020? Bart, you want to jump in? I see you're unmuted.
Sure. So the kind of longer term trends that I find interesting, and some of these are questions rather than answers at this point, is one thing I observed in past research is the persistent sorting of nationalist beliefs by party. And that's likely to have continued through the current election cycle. So back in the mid-90s, you couldn't really predict somebody's partisan identification based on their nationalist beliefs about what they thought America meant. By the early 2000s and on going forward to 2016 and onward, the beliefs about what America meant became in the electorate became drastically sorted by party. What's interesting about that is that sorting mechanism was observable again in early 2000s, long before Trump. And in an American Journal of Sociology article that I published on this, we argued that actually that shows that the demand among Republicans for a Trump-like figure long preceded the 2016 election, which is why we saw candidates like Sarah Palin gain some traction, why we saw the Tea Party take off, and Trump really kind of filled in that demand in a way that nobody else was able to. Sort of his maybe kind of a unique ability to feel the crowd and to say anything that the crowd wants to hear in a particularly effective way. And so I guess the question from me, and this is something that I've got a survey in the field this week and we'll find out in the future, it was whether that sorting of nationalist beliefs has continued through 2024 and whether essentially we're at a situation where Republicans and Democrats fundamentally disagree about what the nation means. We already saw that in 2016. We saw it further exacerbated in 2020. And likely even more so by 2024. The other trends that I'm looking to, and I think we'll talk about them a little more in subsequent questions, is what happens to the gender gap in this particular election. And so What's interesting is actually the gender gap is relatively stable across U.S. presidential elections, typically on the order of 5 to 10%. Women voting Democratic, more likely to vote Democratic, men more likely to vote Republican. But there was an exception to that in 2020, where the gender gap basically closed. And so there's a question of what will happen in this election. The midterms, the last midterms suggest that maybe there'll be more enthusiasm in terms of turnout among women, and if women indeed vote more likely to vote for Democrats this time around again, that could favor the Harris ticket, obviously. And then the other trend that we'll get to again in more detail later is what happens with Latino voters, right? So we've seen a gradual shift away from the Democratic Party and toward the Republican Party and toward Trump as a result in the last couple of elections among Latino voters. I don't want to overstate this. Latinos still overwhelmingly support Democratic candidates, but less so over time. And current polling suggests that trend has continued through 2024. Latinos are also particularly unlikely to turn out, actually. So although their support for Democrats has been kind of wavering over the last few elections, turnout remains low in this group. So it's also interesting to see what happens on that front. But I think more importantly, I find interesting what is not changing. And that is the kind of rhetoric that the Republican Party, which has been thoroughly radicalized and co-opted by the Trumpist movement, the kind of rhetoric that is on offer is basically the same thing we saw in 2016 and 2020, but with a volume dialed up further and with the quiet parts that even louder than before. And the other thing that is unchanging is, we can slice and dice the electorate however we like, but the truth is white voters vote for Trump, full stop. Right? Across every category. White voters favor Trump and favor Republicans over Democrats. And that is the sort of uncomfortable truth with which we're living with in every election. And so to the degree that there is, a chance of Harris winning this election, it'll be once again, thanks to the turnout by Black voters, by Latino voters, and by those whites who oppose another Trump term. But that is an unchanging reality that it's been with us for quite some time. And maybe one last thing I'll say is the other thing that's not changing is, in some ways, general elections are straightforward, right? Republicans vote Republican, Democrats vote Democrat. That's it. And then there's a question of turnout, et cetera, on the margins. But that sort of truism hides the fact or masks the fact that this is not just any Republican candidate, right? This is a racist, ethno-nationalist, populist, authoritarian candidate who threatens the very fabric of American liberal democracy. And yet, Republicans vote Republican, right? And that is, again, unchanging and deeply worrisome. So I think I'll end on that and look forward to hearing from other co-panelists.
On that happy note, anyone else want to jump in? Yeah, please, Amber.
I guess I'll jump in because I'm zooming in from a battleground state. And so it's politics all the time in Wisconsin. 2024 is no different than 2020, 2016, where we're talking about just, tens of thousands of votes. That's it. 0.6 percentage points, 0.8 percentage points separating Biden versus Trump or Trump versus Clinton. So I think my comments here in the question that Jen posed about what are the things that I'm looking at, I think come through a Wisconsin lens, which I think is relevant since Wisconsin in 2020 was the tipping point state that determined the Electoral College. And we'll certainly be watching, Wisconsin next week. So the trends that I'm looking at here, one is a national, though we see it really here in Wisconsin, the rise in economic pessimism among voters. And here it's not just this sort of what we call the sociotropic sort of evaluations, how's the nation doing? Is the country moving in the right track or the wrong track? But here the worrisome trend for Harris would be the real steep rise in the share of Wisconsinites who say that they are just struggling. They're just getting by. So we have an increase in those saying that they're struggling, versus, if you're looking at, 2016, 2017, 2018, and so on, half of those polled would say that they're living comfortably. That really changes over the course of 2023. And despite inflation cooling, those kind of attitudes, perceptions that things are really hard have not changed. They're not, moving. They're pretty stuck. So that's one. The second is it's Wisconsin, and we always talk about the sort of political geography of this state. And so the second sort of thing that I'm looking at is actually the suburbs. So perhaps, I guess, in conversation with some of the things that Bart mentioned, thinking about race and partisanship, 2016, 2018, 2020, 2022, what we saw in Wisconsin was counties that historically have been deep red in places where Republicans would gain a lot of votes from these places. This is the sort of suburban ring around Milwaukee, the largest city in the state, that those suburbs have trended blue, particularly if those are suburbs with a large share of college-educated voters in them. And so the sort of trend, the bluing, if you will, of the suburban outlying counties, not just outside of Milwaukee, but also outside of Madison, is a trend. And Harris will need those votes in order to carry Wisconsin. I know we've got a question later about turnout, so I'm going to save my turnout point for later. And although this is a turnout, I don't think they've come up yet, so I'll just raise them in the conversation, and that's younger voters. We have from polling data in Wisconsin a huge bump among younger voters when Harris replaced Biden at the top of the ticket. So that's, for Harris Walls, those are good signs. There's questions about, to put this in context, young voters under 30 in 2020, Biden got about 6 out of 10 of those voters, according to exit polls. This year, polls are suggesting a growing gender gap among Gen Z voters, and a real shift to the left for young women, and perhaps a slight rightward shift among young men. So that's a trend I'll be looking at. And in states like Pennsylvania and in Wisconsin, what turnout looks like in those college towns, those college campuses. 2020 was our pandemic election, where the sort of standard get out the vote efforts were altered because of the just a pandemic. And so that sort of return to more face-to-face, the more vigorous campaign, get out the, mobilization, get out the vote efforts, whether or not that kind of makes a difference in increasing turnout among younger voters is the third sort of thing I'll be looking at.
And I'll just add one, this is less based on systematic observation and more based on, also being in a swing state in the, the big city that everybody's canvassing. So it does seem to me that there's more, there's both more attention from the campaign to poor and working class neighborhoods in Philadelphia than I think there had been in previous years from the Democratic campaign. And there's also more, the organizations that were founded after Trump was elected are more mature and are able to really field a ground game to mobilize less likely voters that they think will be anti-Trump than was true in 2020 because they were newer and because of the pandemic. So I do think there's a lot of really good ground game happening from the Democrats, and that's something a lot of people and just Harris was in Philadelphia in barbershops and so on. And that's something that, you know, a lot of people that I interviewed who were from Philadelphia said, we, you know, we don't see politicians in our neighborhood. We don't, you know, they don't come here. They don't talk to the leaders here. And it seems like that's happening a bit more. Again, based more on sort of impressions and news coverage than a systematic analysis of who exactly went where 4 years or 8 years ago. But it does seem to be the case, and I think that is good for bringing people into politics who had been feeling distant from it, both the canvassing efforts and the campaign stops.
Oh, okay. It's my turn. The trends that I have been really thinking about, in particular, with Black voters in mind, has really been a question of, you know, a lot of conversation has been had about Black turnout moving in a downward trend as it pertains to in recent elections, but a lot of that is relative to the Obama era, right? And so we're talking about massive amounts of turnout and then kind of a return back to kind of an equilibrium where Black voters were kind of sitting for the vast majority of the time that we've been voting. And so I'm interested now in how we understand whether or not we should expect to see a massive uptick. I think we're hearing a lot of talk about voter registration in certain areas is up among Black voters and what that means, and then also the extent to which we should expect there to be this meaningful shift on the grounds of gender, right? So a lot of conversation has been had about Black men, and this has been something that was had, you know, in 2020, both at the presidential level, but also at the gubernatorial level in states like Georgia. And then what we ultimately end up seeing is that the numbers never quite pan out just as much, but the prevalence of the conversation persists. And so I'm interested to see kind of whether or not the gender gap that does exist within the Black community and the Black electorate, whether it widens in the way that people are kind of expecting it to, the way that many Republicans are hoping that it will, and also the extent to which it makes as much of a difference as people expect it to. If the number of people who are increasing in their registration, you know, are Black women relative to 2020, there's been a massive uptick in the number of young Black women who have at least registered to vote. And so I'm interested in understanding kind of the way that the expectations that people have, whether they manifest in the way that we expect them to, and also kind of on the other side, thinking about, you know, how do we one of the more frustrating things about this particular election cycle that I've been kind of navigating is this conversation surrounding Black men and the lack of conversation surrounding white women, who we have seen be kind of a very important part of the decision-making process about who, you know, who wins and who does not. And there's been this kind of massive focus on just men of color in general. And so I'm interested to really understand how these trends and the expectations kind of coalesce as we kind of move closer, and if they do at all.
Thank you all. Those are four fantastic answers. I wanted to ask you all about the polls, and the polls that we've had this cycle have shown that voters are thinking a lot about the economy, democracy, and immigration, although those issues tend to vary by political party of the voter. Do you think that there are things that the polls are missing about how Americans are interpreting these issues in 2024, or the importance or salience of these issues for voters in this election cycle?
In what order should we go, Jen?
Whichever order you like. We could start with you, Bart, since you're first alphabetically.
I'll keep this short because I actually am very interested to hear what others say about this. But I mean, the polls are, I think, right on this in the sense that these are the issues that matter. But of course, exactly what being worried about the economy means, for instance, is something that's worth unpacking. And so, Amber already mentioned that the question of sort of sociotropic versus individual concerns, right? Are you doing less well economically, or are you worried that people like you are doing less well? And of course, both are important. The sociotropic concern often masks all kinds of kind of group status threat concerns that are not strictly economic. And you know, there's also this question of how do we think about economic grievance in general among, say, Trump supporters, right? When whites across various income categories, not just those worse off, support Trump on average, or the fact that although certainly the economic well-being of non-college whites has been declining over time, it still surpasses in relative terms the economic well-being of non-whites with college education, of non-BA Black voters, non-BA Latino voters, and so forth. And so, you know, there's this. We'll come back, I think, to issues of class later on in this conversation. I think those are really important. But you know, economic concerns can often mask and be a proxy for all kinds of other status related concerns, racial concerns, and so forth that are not just strictly economic per se. The other issue in terms of immigration, I mean, this is sort of, you know, concern over immigration is part and parcel of radical right politics across all contemporary democracies, I think. And it's sort of one component of ethno-nationalism, of kind of the nationalist beliefs that I alluded to earlier in my comments. And I think the fact that this is a really important concern among white voters is not surprising, and particularly white Trump supporters. It's interesting also to see that issue become salient among some Latino voters. And so, you know, earlier I talked about the fact that there has been a kind of a gradual shift of Latino voters from the Democratic Party toward the Republican Party, although again, Latinos are still primarily Democratic. But if you look at Latino voters who support Trump, immigration is actually one of their top concerns. The economy is still at the top, as it is across the board typically. But immigration, and particularly undocumented immigration, is among top 4 concerns, as is crime, violence, and so forth. And so it's actually kind of interesting to think about what drives Latino Trump support, and how do we think about people who are typically framed as sort of, you know, as themselves immigrants or descendants of immigrants being concerned about immigration. And not surprisingly, there's a lot of heterogeneity within the Latino population in terms of countries of origin. So obviously we know that Cubans or Cuban Americans vote very differently than Mexican Americans. There's heterogeneity by generation. So third generation Latinos are more likely to swing toward Trump than first or second generation Latinos, and so forth. But this notion of you know, for a long time we heard about, you know, demography is destiny, and as the U.S. turns you know, majority minority over time, the Republican base is going to erode. That turns out to be a lot more complicated than I think people had thought. And Trump, you know, increasingly finds support among non-white voters as well, who are maybe more culturally conservative, who are perhaps dealing with economic grievance as well, and for whom sort of immigration, as they see it, it continues to be actually a problem, despite the fact that they may themselves be descendants of immigrants. But again, I don't want to overstate this. Again, the Trump support is strongest among whites, and Latinos still overwhelmingly support Democratic candidates. So I think I'll stop there.
Daniel, would you like to jump in?
Yeah, I would just add, I think Bart said a lot of what I might have said, and some things smarter than me, but I think the point he touched on at the end about heterogeneity within groups is really important to remember when you're looking at all of these things. So, you know, it's true that it's true that you know, Latinos are moving. There's also enormous heterogeneity. I think also when we this is on the agenda for later, but when we look at you know, what does somebody mean when they tick the economy is my most important issue, right? Some people mean I'm not doing well. Some people mean I think I like Trump, and people who like Trump say they're concerned about the economy, so I'm ticking the economy because people who like Trump care about the economy, right? So there's a lot, you know, and all of these polls, there's, you know, they capture something, but they miss a lot of heterogeneity. They also miss people, right now all of the polling is pretty much all of the polling is likely voters or registered voters, which fair enough if you're trying to understand how the election is going to go, but it means you're missing an awful lot of other people. It also means a lot of what the polls are saying is based on pollsters' best guess about how to weight the people who happen to respond to polls. And that is a problem that's getting tougher and tougher every year as survey response gets lower and lower and lower. So I think that's just important. And, I'm sure that if you had a true random sample, you would also see that the economy is at the top of the list of issues. So it's not a question about that so much, but exactly how the groups break down, exactly how they're planning to vote. Some substantial portion of that is polling firms making their best guesses about how to weight rather than sort of the gold standard of random sample research that we all learn about in theory. And I think that's really important to remember as we talk about polling as the election comes up. They could be wrong in any number of directions, and they have a big incentive to not be too different from all the other ones. So I think that's part of what we're seeing.
I would
Kelly?
also say that like one of the things that I struggle with is as a person who like collects a lot of surveys, it's really hard to get like people of color to take surveys just in general, particularly men of color. And so I struggle with this reality because what ends up happening is that the weighting process kind of is using not necessarily a ton of men of color to make, very big claims that then I'll speak for myself, send me into a tailspin. And so that the reality of what the sampling methods look like and for whom, and then who you are getting, right? Like who are the people who are actually, answering the phone, responding to the email, responding to the text message, however it's being disseminated, I think is also something that in some ways gives me pause. Because I think that while obviously surveys and polls offer us a lot of information, I think that their job is to be splashy and to kind of get people to click and to do certain things, that and they may be making claims that are big claims with not big numbers of people from the population that they're talking about. And that, especially when it comes to communities of color, that tends to be more true than it is not true. And so then the conclusions that we're able to draw from about those populations tend to have the potential to be much larger and much more splashy than they are kind of grounded in actual kind of reality. And so I think that that's a really important thing to kind of think about. And we're in a moment now where people are feeling more kind of poll fatigue, I would call it, and also a lot more skepticism about the polls. I mean, I think, was it Nate Silver who just wrote an op-ed that was like, this is what I said, but also don't believe me. And so I think that there are ways in which we kind of the dependency on the numbers themselves is in this kind of waning space where people, and maybe it's because people just aren't hearing the things that they want to hear, and so they're already dubious. And maybe it's also that, to other points made that, the people who are actually taking these may not be your, middle of the bell curve people. And so what conclusions can we truly draw? And how much can we take away from some of these polls? Yeah.
Yeah, I'll just be really be just picking up on that, putting these polls into context, the ways in which we word the questions, we order them, all of those things aside. I'll just take the example of the economy and the ways in which there's so much that could fit within naming or putting the economy at the top. So I'm curious to see or to dig more into research that takes a bit more qualitative approach, honestly, to the study of public opinion. I'll just give an example. This past year, we partnered with we partnered with Milwaukee PBS, where we had invited voters to come together over dinner to talk about the issues. And the recruitment strategy was, very intentional, trying to get self-identified Democrats, self-identified Republicans to come. And each dinner conversation was centered around an issue: the economy, education. We did democracy, and we did immigration. But I'll just share that the immigration one, the ways in which these issues can be just signaling, like I'm going to put immigration because I'm a Trump supporter, and that's what what Daniel just had said earlier. But I'll just share in the conversation on immigration. So this is an hour-long conversation, right? They're not online taking a quick, clicking and answering an online survey, or if they're picking up their phone and answering and talking to a pollster. This is an hour-long conversation about immigration. And you could see the ways in which all sorts of things were weaving in. Take immigration. We had one woman, conservative, said, I'm supporting Trump. The border was, border security was a key issue. But as she talked a lot about being supportive of immigration, but she really focused on like the legality, having a process. And it led into this sort of discussion in some ways about a sense of feeling kind of powerless, feeling that things were out of control. And this was something that, and you could just, although it wasn't perfectly stated, you got the sense that there's other stuff going on in her life as well that is feeding into the ways in which she is making sense of a topic. We're in Wisconsin. Immigration does impact this state in many different ways in terms of people who are immigrants or immigrant families themselves. We have a large dairy industry that employs many immigrant workers. But in some sense, it's a state that's quite removed from the border. But you saw the ways in which her personal experience is being reflected in the ways in which she's trying to make sense of this topic, but also the ways in which she's pulling on candidate rhetoric and things that she's seeing on the screen and listening to on the radio. And I think some of this gets missed, a lot of it gets missed in just taking, a random sample of voters and asking them, to answer a survey that's going to take 5 to 7 minutes for them to complete. And so I think it's worth, I guess as just someone who studies public opinion, I appreciate folks who take the more qualitative approach. I think it opens up new questions, new dynamics. In some sense, it's almost like you can be on the leading edge. I think a lot about Kathy Kramer's work and the ways in which she was doing interviews in Wisconsin. And now it's looking back, you're like, oh, of course, you could see these dynamics unfold, but she was looking at these dynamics, in some sense, years before it was showing up really in public opinion surveys. So, a more qualitative approach, can be warranted to help us make better sense and put these sorts of poll responses in context.
Thank you so much. So, probably my last question to you all is something you've touched on in your responses already, but in 2016 and in 2020, a lot of the commentary before the election and even amongst social scientists after highlighted the role of both racism and sexism on voter behavior and partisan identity in that election. In 2024, however, we've heard a lot, not that these are necessarily mutually exclusive, but there's been growing attention to working class people, voters of color, particularly men, who are perhaps considering a vote for Trump. My question, I guess, is how are you making sense of these trends? Do you think this suggests a widening gender gap, a class realignment in the US? Do you think that we're seeing the emergence of a multiracial working class politics in this election, or do you think this has been something that's overblown, as Julian mentioned earlier in his comment?
I can start for variety. So I think a couple things. I think one, we have most of these accounts have what I think is a very, very, very deeply overly simplistic account of class, which is either you have a college degree or you do not. I made a chart one time. I don't think I can find it in time to show it, but like, you know, of people earning over $100,000 a year, like 60% of college degrees, 40% don't. Of people in the next income bracket, more don't have college degrees than do, right? There's not a one-to-one relationship between income and college education. And there's not a one-to-one relationship between advantage overall in college education. So I think when we talk about the quote working class and especially when we talk about the white working class and what we mean is people without college degrees, we're sort of conflating two things. We often think that we're talking about people who are low income, disadvantaged, etc. And like the biggest Trump support, last time I looked, was among people without college degrees who are making plenty of money, right? There's actually sort of a U-shaped I could overstate this, but the very passionate people who go out to rallies and so on are not people who are barely scraping by. So I think it's just generally speaking. So I think that's one thing I think is really important to think about, is just the difference between doesn't have a college degree and is low income. They're associated, but they're not the same thing. I think that's one thing we have to be really thoughtful about when we talk about these things. And I think the other thing I'd say is there's also among people who are elites, I think sort of Bourdieu inspired model is useful for this, that there's a left and a right side of people who are very well off and have college degrees and are elites, and it's aligned with the industries people work in and the regions of the countries people work in, and whether they're in cities or exurbs or so on. And it's not, there's a split among the well-off as well. So it's not just a sort of up, down the income spectrum, or even up, down, the college is a really good predictor of partisanship, but it's not a perfect predictor of partisanship at all, even among white people. So I think that's something we have to pay attention to, is just again, the internal heterogeneity and the way that these sort of shortcuts or correlations between one measure of class and others obscure a lot of really important variation and sort of give us a picture of who we think the modal Trump supporter is that I don't think is accurate. So that's yeah. I could say other things about class and the shifts, but I'll just stop there because that's my bee in my bonnet, or whatever the phrase is that I have about that.
I also think that there is like the variation of experience even within these groups, these economic brackets. Chris Rock has a joke about how he's a very successful person, but all his neighbors are like doctors and lawyers, right? So like that he's making all of this money, but he's living in a neighborhood surrounded by a bunch of like white individuals who are not nearly making nearly as much money as he is, right? And so that when we start thinking about these things at the intersections of these different identity spaces, it also creates a much more interesting kind of thing and nuanced thing for us to think about, because even within this notion of working class, one, who knows what that is, and there is this kind of sense. There's something about that particular kind of moniker that I think lots of people who we as scholars may not identify as working class would call themselves that, for one reason or another. And so that there are lots of ways in which kind of self-perception operate within this, as well as an intersection of different identities that come together to kind of create an experience that I think would inform, at least in part, maybe some of the reasons why these individuals are seeing something in what Trump is doing. And I also think that part of this narrative, and I think it's something that I struggle with, but I think Trump presents a kind of aspirational situation for a lot of individuals that I I think comes out of like the 90s when he was really someone that lots of people were seeing, and kind of he lived this very larger than life. He was on Home Alone, The Apprentice, like all of those things created a very big kind of social zeitgeist type of situation for him that I think a lot of individuals who, again, are not working class as I think many of us kind of conceptualize in our mind, um, but yet see him and think like this is something that I want to aspire to. But that aspiration is something that comes at the intersections of all of these other identities that then he has a very, he has a penchant for kind of tapping into. Um, and I think that when you consider, you know, I think obviously gender plays a part in this as well, because there is this idea of, you know, what a working class man looks like. And I think that there is also something about kind of working really hard and striving, and that the American dream feels like a very, in some ways, implicitly gendered idea of like, you know, I'm grinding to make it. And that when you take all of that together, I think it's important to kind of contextualize some of these kind of class-based understandings with all of these other things, because one, to Daniel's point, I think that you know, class obviously operates so differently for different people, but also the way that people perceive themselves in as it pertains to class also makes a really, really, really big difference here.
Amber, you want to go? I've got it.
Sure. Although I fear that what I'm gonna say is gonna like pivot. Um, so remind me this, we're like, I don't know how much more I want to say on like on gender. I feel like that my fellow panelists have really covered a lot of ground here. Um, what I guess what I'm curious about, or what I feel is a bit unresolved or unanswered, and we haven't touched on it here, is I forget who opened up and said, oh, you know, this has been a wild election season. You know, we've had 2 assassination attempts, all that. Yes, you know, a new candidate replacing the Democratic nominee and so on. But it's also remarkable that the pandemic is something that it happened. We seem to be experiencing this collective kind of deliberate like forgetting, and yet it is also so present. And I'll come back to the sort of economic evaluations and how we're trying to make sense of this. It's remarkable how we're also kind of frozen in time in some sense, that for many voters, there's this idea of what 2019 was like. That's just, it's kind of just there. I don't have this all sort of you know, fleshed out here. So apologies. This is like the worst thing to do in a thing like this, is to come at the group with something that I haven't been able to really figure out. But thinking about what the impact of the pandemic has been, in the ways in which it's affecting our politics in kind of predictable, but very as well as unpredictable ways as well. I guess I will say something, I suppose, on gender, the economy, status. This was, I think, Clarence. There was someone in the chat who raised this question. I'll just read the question here. The question was, polls show gender gaps in presidential preference. Are there differences in how women and men perceive the current state of the economy, and what should be done about it? I think this is also a really interesting area for research. If there are graduate students, you know, people who are kind of the beginning, I think that this is really interesting. You know, my research on how Americans were evaluating the economy during the Trump era showed that for some men, particularly white men without a college degree, sorry, Daniel, I'll use a very simplistic sort of classification here. Trump was a huge status boost. The ways in which some voters interpreted what his rise meant for them, even if their objective circumstances were not changing. was kind of remarkable. Again, that gender gap and sort of evaluating the economy at a time in which actually women were gaining and experiencing, in some sense, improvements in their economic well-being, but men growing much more optimistic during those years. I think we're seeing some of this playing out still. Trump's remarkable in terms of his ability to really craft rhetoric that empowers some voters. I think it is linked to some of the data that Daniel showed at the very beginning about voter turnout and who kind of benefits from a particular style of political rhetoric and campaigning and who doesn't. Now, there is something that has changed, and I don't know if folks are making too much of this. But polls here, I'll just draw on polls in Wisconsin. And it's hard because for all the reasons that Julian mentioned about the difficulties of polling, particularly Black men, there has been a slight shift to the right among Black Wisconsinites who respond to polls, and a slight left tilt among white voters, predominantly women, but not exclusively. And so I'm curious how this is going to play out and what those marginals are going to look like, in the exit polls. I don't think we've got a full sense of this sort of intersection between race, gender, and class. So apologies that I don't have it all sorted out, but I think we've got a lot more work to do to kind of really interrogate and understand these dynamics. In a context in which, as Bart said, Republicans vote Republicans and Democrats vote Democrat. We can hold both of those things to be true.
Those are terrific comments, and I feel a little bad coming at the end of this sequence of responses because all of you so beautifully complicated the picture of how do we think about class, everything with the intersection of race, class, gender. And so I agree with everything that's been said. I think maybe the one thing to say is if we for a second go back to simplifying and say, okay, class equals college education versus not, et cetera. There was a tendency after 2016 to say that Trump was supported by the working class, which of course we know is untrue. Trump was supported by the white working class. And what often was forgotten at the time is that the working class, if we define it based on education, is only 55% white and declining, right? By 2025, next year or the year after that, it's going to flip where it's predominantly non-white. The working class is not, factory workers as we used to imagine it back in the day, although that's also part of the working class, but it's overwhelmingly the service sector. For a good, decade and a half, women have become a large share of the working class. So what the working class means has shifted. And what's interesting about that is, the question you posed, Jen, was about kind of cross-race coalitions, working class coalitions. Is that emerging as kind of part of Trump support? And I think the evidence points that that's not to the fact that that's not the case, or to the degree that things are shifting in the kind of outside of the white working class. It's not shifting based on class interest and class considerations. And so, if we think about it, Black voters are overrepresented in the working class, and yet Trump support among Black voters is minuscule, right? We're talking about 6-7% overall, and yes, this varies by gender, which is really important to think about, but it's minuscule. So this is, the notion that to be working class is to support radical right politicians. No, it's to be working class and white. Right, that intersection that results in Trump support. And then, of course, there's also a large and growing overrepresentation of Latinos among the working class. And we already talked about this a little bit. So one could argue, well, to the degree that Latinos are turning toward the Republican Party gradually, again, just a little bit, but gradually over the years, maybe that's pointing to like a cross-class coalition, right? Potentially among whites and Latino working class voters. But if you think about what's driving Latino support for Trump, it's, although again, again, the economy is at the top, and we've all already unpacked how complicated that is. It's other issues as well, right? It's violent crime, as I mentioned. That's right at the top of second most important issue for Latino Trump supporters. The next one, again, the third most important issue for Latino Trump supporters is immigration and border control. So are these class concerns? Well, maybe, in the sense that maybe working class Latinos are worried about competition with newer immigrants over jobs. That's certainly possible. But it's not a purely class concern, right? It's a class concern combined with ideas about nationalism, about who's deserving and undeserving as an immigrant, about what kinds of immigrants are acceptable or not. It's about taking the ladder from underneath you, right? After you've climbed up as well. It's a complicated matter. And then the final thing to say is that, again, I think I already mentioned this, but in terms of thinking about among working class voters, who's the most poor off, right, in terms of economic well-being, it's not white working class voters, right? Although, yes, their economic fortunes have been declining. If you think about relative income shares, they're still the top of the hierarchy. They're doing way better economically than Latino or Black working class voters. And yet, again, support among Black working class voters for Trump is minuscule. So I think the class question is a really complex one. And I sort of, to the degree that we have bees in our bonnets, as Daniel was saying, this notion of sort of equating working class with Trump support, I've always found quite problematic. And even with the qualifiers, when you kind of do a race class intersection, it also is far more complicated. So I sort of come back to this, the thing that I started with is that overwhelmingly Trump draws his support from ethno-nationalists, kind of populist-oriented, somewhat authoritarian voters who are predominantly white across all other intersections.
Thank you. Thank you all. So we're actually at time already. We did answer one audience question that was in the chat box in my defense. Thank you to the 4 panelists tonight, and thank you all in the audience for coming out. This has been a really fascinating discussion, and we'll see what the elections hold for us next week.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.